The dust of the high plain settled on everything, a fine grit that coated the soul as much as the weathered planks of the town hall. It was a cruel kind of dust, the color of forgotten promises, and it rose in choking clouds under the boots of the men who had gathered for the spectacle. In the center of the mocking circle stood Eliza, a woman carved from the unyielding landscape itself. Her hands, though calloused from roping cattle and mending fences, were clenched so tightly at her sides that her knuckles were white as bone. The town doctor's words, delivered with a pity she despised, had branded her years ago, barren. A field left fallow, a well run dry. This public pronouncement, a casual cruelty tossed over a drink at the saloon, had made her an object of whispers, a woman defined by an absence. Beside her, shifting his weight with a discomfort that seemed to ripple through his entire large frame, was Thomas. He was the town's silent joke, a man whose gentle nature was invisible beneath a physique the local wits deemed too much. They called him Ox, Simple Tom, a dozen other names that chipped away at a man until only a caricature remained. He never spoke back, his eyes, the color of river stones, fixed on some distant point only he could see. And clinging to Eliza's skirt, a shadow in the harsh afternoon sun, was Lily, her small niece left in her care after a fever took her sister. The child had not spoken a word since, her trauma a locked room to which Eliza had no key. Her silence was a constant, aching weight in Eliza's chest. The architect of this humiliation, Bartholomew Higgins, a rancher whose wealth was matched only by his pettiness, stood on the saloon porch, a smug grin splitting his face. He had lost a wager to Eliza's late father years ago, a sliver of land he felt was rightfully his, and his resentment had curdled into this public theater of revenge. He raised his flask. "We are gathered here today," he boomed, his voice slick with false piety, "to join two souls who are perfectly matched in their uselessness. A barren cowgirl and a man who's more beef than brains." A wave of brutish laughter rolled through the crowd. Eliza felt Lily tremble, a small, terrified bird. She looked at Thomas, truly looked at him, past the jeers and the ill-fitting clothes. She saw not the buffoon they described, but a profound, deep-seated shame in his averted gaze, a humiliation so total it seemed to swallow the very air around him. He was drowning, and the whole town was watching. Something hard and defiant, a vein of steel forged in lonely nights and long-held grief, solidified in Eliza's spine. She would not be their entertainment. She would not let them break this man, or this child, any more than they had already been broken. The makeshift preacher, a drunkard from the saloon, slurred his way through a mockery of vows. "Do you, Eliza, take this lump of a man," he snickered. The crowd leaned in, hungry for her tears, for her final, shattering indignity. Eliza lifted her chin. The dust motes danced in the slivers of light between the bodies pressing in. She felt Lily's tiny hand grip her leg, a desperate anchor. She looked directly at Thomas, whose own eyes finally met hers, wide with a kind of pleading terror. In them, she saw a reflection of her own isolation. Her voice, when it came, was not a shout, but it cut through the noise with the clarity of a bell. It was low, steady, and utterly devoid of fear. "I will," she said, her gaze unwavering. The laughter faltered, confused. Higgins's smile tightened. Eliza took a half-step closer to Thomas, a deliberate, protective movement. She was not just accepting the arrangement, she was claiming it. "I'll stand by you," she added, the words a vow made not to the drunken preacher or the leering crowd, but to the broken man beside her and the silent child at her feet. A stunned silence fell, thick and heavy. The joke had soured. In her defiance, Eliza had stolen their power, transforming their act of cruelty into her act of will. They were escorted from the town not with jeers, but with a discomfited quiet, the townsfolk shuffling their feet, suddenly ashamed of their own reflections in her unwavering dignity. Higgins, his face purpled with rage at being upstaged, pointed them toward the old Miller place, a ruin on the edge of his own vast property. "Your honeymoon suite," he spat, the words a final, venomous dart. The homestead was a skeleton picked clean by wind and neglect. The door hung from a single leather hinge, groaning a constant complaint against the wind. The roof was a colander of missing shingles, and the windows were hollow eyes staring out at a landscape of thistle and rock. It was a place where hope came to die. As the last of the riders disappeared over the ridge, a profound silence descended, broken only by the whistling wind. Despair, cold and sharp, pricked at the edges of Eliza's resolve. This was it. This was their life. A ruined house, a broken man, a silent child. She watched Thomas, who stood staring at the dilapidated structure, his shoulders slumped, the weight of a lifetime of mockery pressing down on him. Lily huddled closer to Eliza, her small face buried in the folds of her skirt. For a long moment, nobody moved. The wind whipped a strand of hair across Eliza's face, stinging her eyes. She could crumble. She could sit down in the dirt and weep for the life she'd lost, for the injustice of it all. But then she felt the tremor in Lily's small body. She looked at the house not as a tomb, but as a challenge. A task. Inside, the floor was thick with dirt and the debris of forgotten lives. A broken chair lay on its side, its legs splayed like a dead animal. But in the corner, there was a hearth, choked with soot but built of solid river stone. A foundation. With a deep breath that tasted of dust and determination, Eliza found a tattered broom left behind by the last unfortunate souls. She began to sweep. The sound was scratchy, rhythmic, a small act of order against a universe of chaos. It was a declaration. We are here. We will not be erased. The first night was a long, cold vigil of silence. Darkness seeped into the one-room cabin, filling the corners like black water. Eliza managed to start a small, sputtering fire in the stone hearth, its meager light pushing back the oppressive gloom but not the chill that seemed to emanate from the very earth. She had little, but she shared what she had. A half-loaf of stale bread and a canteen of water. She tore the bread into 3 pieces, handing one to Lily, who ate mechanically, her eyes still wide and vacant. She offered the 3rd piece to Thomas. He was sitting on the floor across the room, his large form hunched, making himself as small as possible. He looked at the bread in her outstretched hand for a long moment before taking it with a slow, hesitant motion, his fingers barely brushing hers. He did not eat it. He just held it, turning it over and over in his massive hands. Later, as a sliver of moon rose in the broken window frame, Eliza settled Lily into the driest corner of the room, covering the child with her own worn wool shawl, the only source of real warmth they possessed. She expected Thomas to claim a corner for himself, to fall into an exhausted sleep. Instead, he rose silently and went to the doorway. He didn't try to fix the broken hinge in the dark. He simply sat on the threshold, his back to the room, his body filling the gap where the door should have been. He became the door. Eliza lay awake for hours, watching the powerful silhouette he cast against the pale moonlight. He did not move, a stoic guardian against the vast, empty darkness and the predators, both animal and human, that might lurk within it. The wind howled, rattling the loose planks, but it could not get past him. She saw then that he was not a burden she had been saddled with, but a shield. In the heart of her desolation, a strange and unfamiliar feeling began to take root, a fragile sprout of something that was not pity, but a nascent, grudging respect. They were 2 strangers, bound by a cruel joke, yet in this broken place, he had instinctively taken up the post of protector. His silence was not empty, it was watchful. The sun rose thin and pale, casting long shadows across the frost-covered ground. The dawn of their new life. The days that followed unfolded in a slow, rhythmic procession of silent labor. There were no words exchanged, for none were needed. Their communication was written in the language of shared purpose, of survival. Eliza rose with the first light, her energy a quiet, relentless force. She scavenged for firewood, her hands growing tougher. She found a small, rusted bucket and hauled water from a distant, trickling creek. With a shard of metal, she tilled a small patch of stubborn earth near the cabin, a promise of a garden. She picked wild herbs, her knowledge of the land a deep, inherited wisdom. She mended their clothes with thread pulled from a burlap sack, her stitches small and neat, each one a tiny act of defiance against their ruin. While she created a world of small comforts within, Thomas waged a silent war against the decay without. He moved with a surprising economy of motion for a man his size. He found the broken-off door, and with rocks and salvaged nails, he painstakingly rehung it until it swung true and could be barred at night. He climbed onto the roof, a dangerous, precarious task, and began plugging the holes, using scavenged planks, packed mud, and sod. He moved with a patience that was almost monastic, his focus absolute. Eliza would watch his hands. They were enormous, the knuckles swollen and the palms crosshatched with calluses, the hands of a man used to brutal, heavy work. But when he handled a piece of wood or fitted a stone, they were impossibly gentle, precise, and knowing. They were not the clumsy paws of the oaf the townspeople described, they were the hands of a craftsman. He worked from sunup to sundown, and when he came inside, exhausted, he would accept the meager meal she offered with a quiet nod of his head. They were a pair of solitary planets, orbiting the shared sun of their survival, the silence between them no longer tense, but companionable, filled with the sounds of work, of life being rebuilt from rubble. One afternoon, Thomas did not work on the house. After his morning meal, he simply walked away, heading toward the low-lying hills to the west without a word or a backward glance. A cold knot of anxiety tightened in Eliza's stomach. Had he abandoned them? Was the burden too much? She tried to dismiss the thought, focusing on weeding her fledgling garden, but her eyes kept straying to the empty horizon. The sun climbed to its zenith and began its slow descent, painting the sky in shades of orange and rose. Still, he did not return. Lily seemed to sense the shift, the new tension in the air, and she stayed closer than ever, a silent, anxious moon to Eliza's worried planet. Just as dusk began to bleed into the landscape, she saw him, a slow-moving figure cresting the hill. He was carrying something. He walked directly to the small porch he had recently stabilized and sat on the steps, his back to her. He seemed to be working on something in his lap, his large hands moving with intricate delicacy. After a time, he stood up, placed a small object on the porch railing, and then went about his evening chores as if nothing had happened. Curiosity finally overcame her. After she had settled Lily for the night, Eliza stepped outside into the cool, clean air. There on the railing sat a bird, carved from a single piece of pale, smooth wood. It was exquisite. The tiny feathers were etched with impossible detail, the head was cocked in a curious, lifelike pose, and the whole thing was so perfectly balanced it seemed ready to take flight. It was a thing of pure, unexpected beauty, a small miracle in their world of dirt and rock. The next morning, as Eliza swept the porch, Lily crept out of the cabin. Her eyes fixed on the wooden bird. She moved slowly, hesitantly, as if approaching a living creature. Her small, thin hand reached out and, for the first time in months, Eliza saw a spark of something other than fear in her niece's eyes. It was wonder. She picked up the bird, her fingers tracing the delicate wings. She clutched it to her chest, a treasure. Later that day, Eliza saw Lily whispering to the bird, her small lips moving, though no sound came out. It was the first crack in the ice of her silence. Eliza looked over at Thomas, who was reinforcing the corner of the cabin, his face set in its usual stoic lines. But she saw him now. Not the town joke, not the silent brute, but the man who had walked miles to find the right piece of wood and had spent hours carving a piece of his gentle soul to give to a broken child. The seasons began to turn. The small garden, nurtured by Eliza's persistent care, yielded a handful of vegetables. The cabin was now weathertight, a sanctuary against the coming cold. A fragile peace had settled over the Miller place, a peace built of shared work and unspoken understanding. This quiet progress, however, did not go unnoticed. One afternoon, a shadow fell across the doorway. Bartholomew Higgins sat astride his fine black horse, his presence a poison seeping into the air. He surveyed the scene with a look of disbelief that quickly curdled into fury. He had expected to find them defeated, starved, begging for his mercy. Instead, he saw a home. The cabin was repaired, a thin curl of smoke rose from the chimney, and the stone-lined garden, though small, was a testament to their resilience. He saw Eliza, her face leaner but her spine no less straight, and he saw Thomas, whose physical labor had sculpted him into a figure of pure, solid strength. "Well, well," Higgins sneered, dismounting. "Playing house, are we? Don't get too comfortable. This land is mine. The water in that creek is mine. Every breath you take because I allow it." Eliza stepped forward, placing herself between him and the door, a silent echo of the way Thomas had guarded it on their first night. "We aren't bothering anyone," she said, her voice low and even. Higgins laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Your existence bothers me." This little display of dignity, it's an insult. He gestured dismissively at the cabin, at the garden, at their entire world. "I could have you thrown off this land before sunset." Thomas had been splitting logs behind the cabin. At the sound of Higgins's voice, he had stopped, the axe held loosely in one hand. He now walked around the side of the house, moving not with aggression, but with a deliberate, grounding weight. He stood a few feet behind Eliza, saying nothing, his presence alone a formidable statement. He was a mountain at her back. Higgins glanced at him, a flicker of unease in his eyes, but he quickly masked it with bravado. "Don't think your train dock scares me," he spat at Eliza. "Remember your place. Both of you. You live on my charity. Don't ever forget it." He remounted his horse, wheeled it around, and galloped away, leaving a cloud of dust and a renewed sense of dread in his wake. The threat hung in the air long after he was gone. That night, the silence was different. It was laced with the old tension, the fear of what Higgins could do. They had built something fragile and good, and he could shatter it with a word. The next morning, Eliza awoke to a new sound. A rhythmic clinking and scraping. She went outside to find Thomas at the edge of their small garden, a place where the earth was littered with stones. He was digging them up, one by one, and setting them aside. He was not just clearing the land. He was gathering. For the next week, he worked with a singular, consuming purpose. He hauled stones, some as large as he could carry, from the creek bed and the surrounding fields. He arranged them in a line around the perimeter of Eliza's garden. And then, he began to build. He was not just stacking rocks, he was fitting them together with the same preternatural skill he had shown with wood. He had no mortar, only an intuitive understanding of weight, balance, and form. He was building a wall. It was a slow, back-breaking process. Day after day, under the hot sun, he lifted, placed, and adjusted, his body slicked with sweat, his muscles straining. The wall grew inch by inch, a low, solid structure of grey and brown stone. It was a monument to his quiet defiance. It was his answer to Higgins's threat. It was a rampart. Eliza watched him, her heart aching with a feeling she couldn't name. She began a new routine. She would bring him water throughout the day, leaving the bucket near his work so as not to disturb his concentration. In the evenings, she took extra care in mending the inevitable rips and tears in his work shirt. They were a team, their partnership solidified in stone and thread. The construction of the wall did not go unnoticed by the outside world. Riders on the main road would slow their horses, staring at the strange sight of the town outcast methodically building a fortress around a tiny garden patch. The story spread through the town, whispered over store counters and saloon bars. They had laughed at him, mocked him, and exiled him. And now, he was building something more permanent and solid than any of their flimsy opinions. The wall became a symbol, its meaning shifting in the town's consciousness from an act of madness to one of profound, stubborn dignity. Higgins returned, as they knew he would. This time, he was not alone. He brought 2 hired men, rough-looking ranch hands with cruel eyes and ropes in their hands. They rode right up to the new stone wall, which now stood waist-high, a ruggedly beautiful and impassable barrier. "Tear it down," Higgins commanded, his voice tight with rage. His men dismounted, grinning, ready to undo weeks of labor in minutes. Eliza rushed out of the cabin, her face pale but resolute. She stood in the small gap Thomas had left for a gate. "Get out of our way, you barren hag," one of the men snarled, reaching for her arm. Before his fingers could touch her, a huge shadow fell over him. Thomas moved faster than Eliza had ever seen him move. He didn't raise his fists. He didn't make a sound. He simply placed his body between Eliza and the men, a wall of flesh and bone to match the one of stone. He was immense, immovable, his face a mask of cold, concentrated fury. Higgins, emboldened by his numbers, strode forward and shoved Eliza hard. She stumbled backward, catching her balance against the wall. That was the line. Thomas turned his head slowly, his river-stone eyes locking onto Higgins. For the first time since the mock wedding, he spoke to his tormentor. His voice was not the simpleton's mumble the town imagined. It was a low, resonant rumble, like stones grinding together deep in the earth. "You will not touch her," he said. The words were a sentence, final and absolute. Just as Higgins opened his mouth to retort, another sound joined the tense standoff, the clatter of hooves and the crunch of wagon wheels. Down the road came a small procession from the town. The blacksmith, his forearms thick as oak limbs. The store owner and his wife. A few farmers who had watched the wall go up day by day. They didn't come with weapons. They simply came and stood, their collective presence a silent judgment. They had witnessed the cruelty. They had seen the resilience. They had watched a joke become a testament, and their shame had finally outweighed their indifference. The blacksmith stepped forward. "That's enough, Higgins," he said, his voice calm but carrying the weight of the community. "Leave them be." Higgins looked from the blacksmith to the other silent, watching faces, and then to Thomas, who had not moved an inch. He saw that he had lost. His power, built on fear and mockery, had crumbled against a wall of stone and a foundation of human decency. Spitting a curse into the dust, he and his men mounted their horses and rode away, their defeat hanging in the air. As their dust settled, a soft rain began to fall, not a storm, but a gentle, cleansing shower that darkened the stones of the wall and washed the grit from the air. The small crowd from town gave a collective, respectful nod, and then quietly departed, leaving the three of them alone inside their sanctuary. Eliza looked at Thomas, truly seeing all of him now, the craftsman, the protector, the gentle soul with a core of unyielding strength. His face was streaked with dirt and sweat, but his eyes were clear. He had found his voice to protect his family. And then, the greatest miracle of all occurred. Lily, who had been watching from the cabin doorway, clutching her small wooden bird, walked slowly across the damp ground. She stopped in front of the giant, intimidating man who had been her silent guardian. She held up the bird, and in a small, clear voice, a sound Eliza thought she might never hear again, she said, "Thank you." She reached out and placed her tiny hand in his enormous, calloused one. The sun, as if on cue, broke through the thinning clouds, bathing the three of them in a warm, golden light. A man judged for his size, a woman judged for her emptiness, and a child lost in silence. There they stood, a family forged in the fires of cruelty, now safe inside the walls of a home they had built with their own hands, their shared hearts, and their unbreakable will to stand by one another.